Hi everybody, my name is Insiyah. Welcome back to another video on data handling. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the different types of graphs. Now, if you haven't checked out the previous video I made, I would recommend that you watch that one first before watching this one because it will help you understand some concepts better throughout this video. Now look at this picture over here. I'm sure this picture looks very familiar to you and it reminds you of the graph that we saw in the previous video. Why? Because you can see this line over here which represents your x-axis and this line over here which represents your y-axis, right? But look at these two pictures. Now the difference in these two pictures is they're both in tables, right? And the last one is this. Now this is a circle. Does it remind you of something like a pizza or a pie? I'm sure it does, right? So now these four pictures that you see are all different kinds of graphs and they're all representing data in their own different ways, right? But all of these four might get a little confusing for you. So we're going to take this slowly and learn them one by one to make it easy for you to understand them, okay? Now we already saw that this first graph over here is the closest to what we learned in the last video, which is why I'm going to be starting with this graph over here because it is the simplest and you will have an easier time learning that. But before I start with that, I want to tell you a story. So now as we all know, due to this COVID-19 pandemic, everybody's stuck at home, right? So one day my friend and I, we were talking and we had an interesting thought. We were wondering how the people in our building were spending their time. Now, if you ask me, after I'm done with my usual study routine, I like to learn how to cook something new. So my friend and I, we decided to message some people from the building and ask them about their leisure time activities or the things they like to do for fun. So we asked about 50 people, so just some of our neighbors and their friends and families, and we noted their responses. So after that, we found out that out of these 50 people, about 20 of them liked watching movies in their free time. And there were about 5 of them that liked to read books, like storybooks or novels, anything. 10 people said they like sleeping, and 15 people said they like playing video games. So here, 20 people watched movies, 5 people read books, 10 people slept, and 15 people played video games. Now, if you watched my previous video, I'm sure this looks very familiar to you, right? In the previous video, I took the example of the marks and the people who got the marks in the test. And in this video, I have taken this example, right? Activities and the people. So now, you probably guessed it correctly. This over here is your data. But like, look at how it is written, right? It's just scattered around. So what kind of data is it? It's my unorganized data. So what is my next step to write this in an organized manner, right? So from this data, I'm going to make a table. So here's my table. Now let's do a quick recap of what the table is supposed to mean. The first column's heading is the activities. The second column are the number of people. And then I just put all that data into my table just like how I wrote it in the previous slide, right? Now in the last video, I also mentioned that the first column heading would be written under the x-axis. What's the x-axis? The horizontal line of the graph, right? And the second column heading would be written next to the y-axis or the vertical line. So we have the horizontal and vertical line, and that would make up your graph. Now, if you remember, I also mentioned in my previous video that data can be any kind of information, right? So in that video, I told you about how my data was my marks in the math test. So clearly my data was numbers over there, right? It was 3 marks, 4 marks, and 5 marks. And in this video, my data are these activities. So movies, books, sleeping, and video games. All of these are my data. And they're not numbers in this case, they're activities. Now, I would request that you take this table down onto your notebook or something because it will make it easier for you to follow the rest of the video and work on the graphs with me. Okay. Now, we have a problem over here. Now, if you remember about the coordinates that we wrote in the previous in the previous video about the points, we can't really do that over here, can we? Because the coordinate I wrote in the previous video were both numbers. There was an x coordinate and a y coordinate. But my x coordinates over here are all names. And I can't write a coordinate with names, right? So because of that, we can't plot these points on a graph. Now for that reason, we have to think of a different way to draw this graph. Now how do we do that? So this graph can be drawn as a bar graph or a bar chart. What is a bar chart? It's basically a graphical representation of data using bars of different heights and colors. Okay, so it's a graph in which the data, so all of my activities and like the relation between the activities and the people is going to be represented using bars. Now what are bars? They're just rectangles. Okay, they're going to be rectangles that we're going to draw starting from the x-axis, so the horizontal line, and they're going to be standing up. Okay, so the first important thing you need to remember about a bar graph is that all the bars or the rectangles are going to be drawn starting from the x-axis, drawn straight up. Okay, next, they're used to compare between different groups or to track changes over time. Okay, now for now, let's focus on this first use. Compare between different groups. What does that mean? Now going back into the story, I asked 50 people about what they like to do in their free time, and I noted their responses. Now from their responses, I categorized into 4 categories, right? The first one was movies, second one was reading, third one was sleeping, and fourth one was playing video games. Now I used their opinions or I used their responses to draw a comparison between how popular these activities are. So I found out that most of the people like watching movies and the least number of people like reading books. This way, I used the opinions of the people. I noted their answers and I used their answers to draw a comparison between how popular these activities are, right? Okay. Now the second use over here, to track changes over time. I'm going to leave this aside for a while and I will come back to it a little later. Okay, now let's look at this graph that we have over here, okay? The first picture I showed you in today's video, does that graph look similar to this? Yes, it does, because they're the same kinds of graph. And what is it? It's a bar graph, okay? Now we're going to draw a comparison between this graph in this video and this graph. If you remember, this is the graph that we saw in the previous video. This is the most basic type of graph that I explained to you, right? Now let's look at the differences. Okay, so this line over here, horizontal line lying down, it's your x-axis, and this axis is called activities. Why? Because it was the heading of my first column of the table. Look into your table onto your book and you will find why I named this axis activities. And this axis is number of people, again, because it's the second column heading, okay? Now, let's look at what I have written on the axis over here. So on my x-axis, I've written movies, books, sleep, and video games. What are these? They're just the names of the activities, am I right? But on in this graph, my x-axis has numbers from 0 to 6. So you'll notice from this graph that the values that your x and y axis, so all of these words or all of these numbers are the values, right? Now, these values need not always be numbers. Depending on what your data is, these values can also keep changing. So sometimes it can be years, sometimes it can be random numbers that mean the marks on the math test, and sometimes it can be these activities like movies, books, sleep, and video games. Okay, so with that the x-axis is pretty understood. Now let's look at the y-axis. Now we're moving on to the y-axis. Now you can see that the y-axis, the biggest number on this axis for me is 20. And over here the biggest number was 6. But if you notice, I haven't written all numbers from 0 to 20 over here, but over here I have written 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? Now why did I do that? Now would you really want to sit and draw a graph in which there were 20 numbers on your y-axis? Because that would be a very big graph, right? And on top of that, do you see this distance over here? 0 to 5, and then the distance between 5 to 10, and then 10 to 15 and 15 to 20. Similarly over here, between every two numbers that are like one after the other, the distance on the graph is the same. Even over here, so not just on the y-axis, even on the x-axis, right? So between any two numbers that come one after the other on the graph, the distance between them is the same. Now that distance is called 1 unit. Okay, so if over here on this graph, instead of writing my 1 over here, I wrote 1 over here, then that would mean that my first number is at a distance of 2 units from where? From the origin, right? So imagine having to draw a graph of 20 numbers on the y-axis where each number was at a distance of 1 unit. That would be a very big graph. And on top of that, you would also have to draw each of them at a distance of 1 unit, right? And that would be too much work and it would become a very big graph. So to not do any of that, we try to find common factors between all the numbers that we already have in our table. Now if you look into the table, all my numbers are 5, 10, 15 and 20. And all these numbers have a common factor that is 5. So instead of writing all numbers from 0 to 20, I just did 5, 10, 15 and 20 because I know that all my values are out of these 4 numbers. So I don't need to waste time and write all 20 numbers. This is why to make our graphs easier to write, we can just use common factors. Now imagine if instead of 20, my numbers went up to 100. You wouldn't want to sit and write numbers from 1 to 100 all at a distance of 1 unit from each other, would you? No, because it would waste a lot of time. So for that reason, we find common factors. Now, let's look at our bars. You can see this first bar is the of movies and it's drawn up to the 20 line over here. So this bar over here is meeting 20 on the y-axis. Similarly, the books bar is meeting 5 on the y-axis. The sleep bar is meeting 10 on the y-axis and video games bar is meeting 15. Okay. Now from this graph, you can also answer a lot of questions. So I told you already that the total number of people involved in this little project that I did were 50. So sometimes I can ask you, how many people out of 50 liked sleeping and playing video games together? In that case, you will add both of these bars. You will add 15 and then you will add 10 for sleep. And then your answer will be 25 out of the 50 people liked sleeping and playing video games together. Okay, sometimes they can also ask you, how many more people liked watching movies than reading books? In that case, you can see that the number of people who liked watching movies are 20, and the number of people who liked reading books is just 5. So since 20 is greater than 5, you can subtract 5 from 20 and you will be left with 15. So your answer is 15. 15 more people liked reading books. 15 more people liked watching movies than reading books. Okay, so now that we have understood bar graphs clearly, let's look at this question. Okay, so now we're going to read this graph and answer the questions over here. Okay, now look at this graph. Now, if you remember, I also mentioned that we will talk about bar graphs that track changes over a period of time a little later, right? So look at this graph over here. Over here, the x-axis tells us the years. The years, the first year over here is 2005 and the last one is 2011, right? So imagine a table in your head, okay? If you want, you can even write it down in your notebook. So draw a table in which the first column heading would be what? It would be years. And the second column heading would be population in lakhs. So this is 100 lakhs, 200 lakhs, 300 lakhs, 400 lakhs, 500 lakhs, and 600 lakhs, okay? And as you can see over here, all these values are at a distance of 1 unit and they're increasing by 100, right? And the years, as I told you, it's from 2005 to 2011, okay? So now in this graph, these bars over here are increasing, which means that population was increasing between 2005 and 2009. It was increasing by 100 lakhs per year. Then in 2010, it decreased a little bit. And then again in 2011, it increased. So this graph is showing us the changes of population over a period of time, right? This is the second use of a bar graph. It helps us to track changes over a period of time. Let's look at these questions over here. So the first question is, in which year was the population 600 lakhs? How will we do this? So we look at the y-axis where the populations are mentioned and we find the number 600. Okay, then we trace a pointer along this line over here and we'll find ourselves at this bar. Why? Because none of these bars are touching 600. They're all very short, right? So only this last bar over here touching 600 lakhs. Then we'll trace the bar down and find the year 2011. Okay, so we'll see if that answer is right later. Second question. Which 2 years had the same population and what was the population? So now you have to look at all these bars and find two bars which are at the same height. Okay, look at the graph carefully and you'll see that it's this bar and this bar, right? Because you can see that it goes along the same line. So now this year is 2008 and this one is 2010. So the 2 years which had the same population was 2008 and 2010. And what was the population in that year? Again, we're going to trace this line, horizontal line, and find the value on the y-axis. It's 400. Now, don't remember, we can't just write 400. Why? Because the y-axis says that all of these populations, all of the population values are in lakhs. So if you just write 400, it would mean that there were only 400 people. But so that's why it's important to mention 400 lakhs. Okay, otherwise you would get the wrong answer. Then, what was the increase in population in 2007 from 2005? In this question, they're asking you to draw a comparison between the number of people in 2007 and 2005. Now, as you can see, the bar of 2007 is greater, is higher. That means there were more people in 2007 than 2005. How many people were there in this year? 300 lakhs. And how many people in this year? 100 lakhs. To find the difference in the number of people, we will subtract 100 from 300 and get 200 lakhs as the answer. Okay, now let's look at the answers. If the first answer is correct, second one is correct as well, and so is the third one. Okay, so with this we come to an end of today's video. Thank you all for watching. I hope you had a fun time learning about bar graphs today. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below and I will see you in the next video.